Yes, okay. Mr. Ringelberg, same, I assume similar comments, right?
Similar comments, but in a different vein, if I could illustrate. So in the idea of RRP3, where we would have hoped for a provision of some sort of adverse or significant encroachment provision so that we could define that, this RRP4 actually much more clearly identifies that, and we feel it's much stronger in its effect and clear in its effect. And I'm going to use an illustration where sometimes well-written, good policy runs into problems and its implications for executing it in the ground. So if I read this in the plain language, I'm participating, I'm writing an EIR for a 19.5-mile restoration in Poudre Creek that connects in below the I-80, so we're covered under this. It's a major project. And so for CEQA, I have to show consistency with the plan. You've articulated a plan. We go through here, we follow the provisions, and then it says, oh, okay, so now I have to show a new study. So I have to look at what values and functions within the floodplain that we may be impairing to show whether or not it's adverse. And when I look at the structures and functions within the floodplain, there's a whole host of academic analyses that may or may not apply, that just sort of dependent on, frankly, which school you went to and what school of thought you believe in ecology. Okay, but I can do that. Then the question becomes, well, what form, for the lead agency, I should say, what form and how detailed, and then in this particular case, we're actually making significant negative alterations to the channel in terms of its floodplain. And so it would fall out under this test. Now, the entire intent is to make it ecologically much more diverse.
Which project is this?
Sorry. We're doing stream restoration, actually a California Department of Fish and Game grant-funded program, multiple stakeholders, grassroots level project, all the things that we're looking for restoration.
Right.
But as part of this process, we are changing the flat water surface of the Yolo bypass to include a meander with some little higher benches on it to provide the floodplain functions we've been talking about now for years.
Right.
That's a significant negative adverse condition to the existing floodplain habitat, changes those values, puts them in a different form, scores very highly on those forms, but because it's significantly adverse in the existing habitat, falls out under this test. And here's the challenge. Now, normally if we had a big project, we'd be able to put together the money and the funding to do that analysis, but because it's a grant-funded project, and there are very few very precious grant dollars available out there, we're yet now spending more money to prove that what we're doing is appropriate under the circumstances to meet your test when all the environmental stakeholders, all the ag stakeholders, all the local interests are all being met in this particular case. And so the question from a practitioner standpoint is now, I'm going to be asked by both the grant holders and by the lead agency to set aside money for the purposes of a consistency review because we have no idea what sort of standards we're going to be held to in terms of consistency review.
Mr. Ray.
Yeah, this is, I'm not sure why, Eric's looking right now to understand, again, remind ourselves the definition of floodplain values and wetlands, that this uses. We're referring to rules that are used by the Corps of Engineers. So I would suspect that if this is an action that was going to require a 404 permit, this information might be needed in any case. But, yeah, it is true. We are asking for information from people to verify that they're complying with the terms and that are in the regulations and the provisions we're trying to encounter. The thought that we would say, well, everybody's fine with it, so it's good enough for us. I guess that might work, in a local project, but we're trying to make sure we're using the best available science in the Delta. I don't think this is an odious process. I've been required as a regulated person on the other side of the counter to put together these kinds of reports in the past. It does take a little time, but I don't think it's a huge burden.
And we're having this discussion because presumably your work will not be complete and permits granted prior to the time, sometime this year, that the Delta Plan actually goes into effect.
That's correct. The lead agency is DFW, and they're concerned that we want to ensure consistency.
Okay. And what suggestion are you making to us?
I guess my suggestion is that we drill down a little bit in terms of what we mean for floodplain values and functions. It can be the industry standard, which would be the Index of Biological Integrity or something along those lines. There are various methods approved. And so the problem we run into is that those indices and those standards are not what we consider the best available science. They are maybe a good generation behind that. And so we know that
we're under statutory obligation to use the best available science, and we, as best I understand it, may not change a statute by our action.
Understood. That's why I'm looking for clarification.
Well, then, yes, I think it's probably fair to say that we expect you to use best available science. If you're saying that's a generation ahead of us and we're using an older, less valid methodology, and I presume you're asking to be exempted from best available science.
No, let me clarify here. So what Mr. Ray articulated was, in fact, say the Corps requests an analysis to show that. It would be the Index of Biological Integrity. It's a generation behind the state of the art in terms of the science for understanding floodplains. If we come forward to this, the Corps, we will have to do analysis beyond the Corps or whichever agency's standards. We don't know at this point what would be considered acceptable for the best available science in front of this body.
Mr. Fiorini.
Eric, as I understand it, the assertion that this policy is dated is because it deals with a floodplain, and now we've determined that meandering waterways in a floodplain perhaps is a better environmental situation. And you're concerned that this is going to prohibit utilizing the best science for a current project. Is that the issue?
It's either an implied prohibition on that, which is basically, depending on how conservative your lead agency is, they would take this as basically saying that you can't do those activities, or it's a huge increase on the cost where the consultants have to identify to the lead agency's interest that we're going to be consistent with the council.
Well, it seems like, I respect somebody that's on the front lines and has to deal with the reality of whatever the regulations are. So this resonates with me. It seems like there ought to be a fix. They're trying to do the right thing. It shouldn't be an impediment or an expensive addition to trying to accomplish what we all think we want to try and accomplish. Is there a staff fix for this?
Well, I guess, Eric, first my question would be, who is the lead agency in this case?
The Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Okay, and what standard what kind of information do they want to see? The project's not being carried out by a local entity of some kind?
The project is being carried out with a number of partners, Yellow Basin Foundation being one of the leads.
Well,
I'm trying to get the rules up.
Has the Department of Fish and Wildlife requested that we modify the plan to somehow lower the amount of scientific review or something? I don't recall seeing it.
No, that's not the case.
If the lead agency isn't asking for any changes to our regulatory policies, then I don't understand.
So the policy is, as stated here, as I've gone through, this project would fall under that as an illustration. The project is covered by this. The best available science to determine the floodplain values, benefits versus the losses of floodplain values and benefits is a standard that's unclear as to how to meet. The existing standards, as I've explained.
And I go back to my point. We do not have the legal authority to change the statutory direction the council used, the best available science and adaptive management. I mean, the statute's clear as hell on that. Yeah. We've spent immense amounts of time, and as best I can determine, you want us to say we won't in your project's circumstance.
I think in this case, really, I think there's a much simpler explanation. This definition, and I've just checked it, is derived from the Corps of Engineers regulations used in their routine 404 encroachment, 404 permit process. People file these sorts of statements that respond to this definition all across the country over and over using standard practices. It's ironic that people have urged us, on the one hand, to use terms that they're easily defined and that they're familiar with, and when we do it, we're criticized. We're requesting that we have some other kind of term that would be more flexible. So I think in this case, what's required is simple, is clear, and the staff's recommendation, provides a simple way to move ahead with this.
And I would also add to that I think providing to hit the best available science. It's a moving target. Everybody recognizes that. But that's why we have early consultation, is to try and have that conversation up front and determine what is consistent with best available science. And I think that's something that will be fairly easy and straightforward.
Well, I hope so, Chris. Thank you.
We'd encourage you to utilize the appellate provisions for early consultation. And although our staff will get mad at me, we'd even appreciate it, an early consultation as early as the 17th of May after our last hearing, when we can wrap up this process. And I also agree that most of the questions are likely to be answered in that kind of a setting.
All right,
Thank you, Mr. Ringberg.